Hi, Ellen. Thanks so much for joining me for Lead Time Chats.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jean. So excited to be here.
So today we're going to talk about a little bit about hybrid teams, but more specifically, how to work well in a hybrid team. And I think this topic has been covered pretty extensively recently with the kind of return to office, that pattern that's happening. But it's been kind of talked about with the approach of like, how do you run a successful hybrid team? But what I wanted to talk about today is like a lot of people, we're kind of in the middle of what has been called the great resignation, where a lot of people are switching jobs, finding jobs that are, maybe in the pandemic, they've discovered or have really clarified their own values or their own priorities in life. So a lot of people are switching jobs to find roles or teams or companies that are more aligned with their values or priorities. And so as people are, starting their new jobs and onboarding, a lot of those people are onboarding onto hybrid teams, and that could be like several people are working in office, several people are working remotely, kind of full time. It could also mean like, some teams are working 3 days a week in office, and then this other team's working another 3 days a week in office, and they just don't have a lot of overlap. So I guess maybe to start us off, as a new hire coming into a hybrid team, like what do you think is most important in considering or in the onboarding?
Yeah, I think that's really spot on, and this is actually pretty common questions as I'm hiring and interviewing candidates. They often ask, maybe not directly that question, but then like, I mean, essentially what they're asking is like, am I going to be successful if I join this particular organization? And I think if I put the hat on as like a potential candidate at a company, some questions that I definitely want to, get the clarity on is whether or not the company actually do remote or hybrid right? And I think in the current situation with COVID is the companies are not, the policies they have are not really set in stone. One minute we think we're like in a pretty good place to go back to the office. Another minute it's like, okay, maybe not so quick. Like I've heard a lot of like bigger companies are delaying their go to office plan. And so like in my mind, as a potential candidate going into a company, it's super important to know that the company has a plan for both remote arrangement and an office arrangement. I don't actually know any company that has like a set policy that they know they're going to go for it. It's still somewhat in flux. And so like in the remote places, and actually when I take a step back, what does it mean by getting things right? What are the important pieces to
Right.
get right? It's very hard to think we have everything perfect, right? So in my mind, there are like three key things that a company needs to get right, both for remote employees and for those who are in office. One is you need a space to build trust, rapport, and to have fun. So like the in office is more obvious where you're in the kitchen together, or maybe in a hallway, you can have those chats. But you need to create that space for remote employees too. So like that's one, a place to trust and have fun. And two, especially for like technical roles like engineering, there needs to be a clear process on technical or even non-technical decision making. I think that's like a really important thing that people often get really frustrated about if that's not clear. Do you have an inclusive process where regardless if someone is remote or in person, they have equal opportunity and say in a process of decision making or getting to the final decision making. And the third piece is to actually, have a process that can surface problem frequently and early. Just because every team is going to be different personalities, different company regulations and policies, and different locations. So they're going to have different challenges. So I think that whether or not they have a process to service problem frequently and early, I think recently when I talk with different sort of remote / hybrid situation, they each have different challenges. One could be that they have time zone challenges where people are actually in different time zones and they don't quite know how to collaborate with each other. Whereas some other ones might be saying that we have remote employees that are relatively new and we don't know how to onboard them, and we don't know how to do team events. So each team and like company is going to have their unique challenges. So having like process to address these problems early is going to be really
important. So maybe even as a candidate asking about a recent challenge and what was the process through which it was surfaced and how was it addressed, like that could give you some insight into, does this team have, like, was it addressed like 6 months later, or was it addressed like, right around when it was surfaced and people started to feel this problem?
Yeah, I think that's actually a great question to ask like an employer for sure. Like, what were the problems and what was the outcome? And like what you would want to hear is like them actually having a thoughtful response to it instead of like, just wait, like magic
like
hand
no problems.
Or,
it's been productivity has been fine. Like that would be probably some flag, a red flag of not being willing to acknowledge any problems, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like not acknowledging problems. It means that potentially they haven't even thought about what could be the problems, or somehow problems are happening and it's not, getting escalated to people who can actually solve them. I think actually there was a candidate that I talked to where, during some of the closing calls, like the candidate was like, yeah, how do you all deal with the fact that some of us are going to be remote and some people are going to be in office? How do you do the meetings? Like, how do you like do the technical decision making, right? So then, one layer deeper, it's like, am I going to be, because this person is likely going to be remote, and one layer deeper is like, oh, am I going to be cut out of like, crucial discussions and learning, and perhaps, cut out of decision making. And so with that particular candidate, I shared with him, oh, here is how we do technical decision making. There is actually a document that everybody comment on. And then there is a meeting dedicated each week at a specific time where everyone can join. It's a Zoom meeting where everybody can participate. And that just take that worry out of it, because specifically the problem you care about is not going to be a problem, or how you can navigate it.
Yeah. This was the first startup I worked at. I wasn't working remotely, but I remember that I left around dinner time every day. So, and a lot of people stayed till like late, like 10, 11, midnight, and they just were kind of socializing and working and kind of doing that throughout the day. But I remember like sometimes coming in the morning and finding out that like decisions had been made at night that like affected the trajectory and the direction of my work, and just feeling kind of like, well, I don't know what to say, right? Like, I don't feel like I can say, hey, don't talk about the product, when I'm not here, but it just wasn't really set up super inclusively. And I imagine those sorts of dynamics only get worse, especially right now. It's probably okay with teams that are working remotely because everyone's feeling the same pain points, including executives and CEOs and everyone. So, but I feel like when it's kind of like half and half or 80-20, it's gonna like those problems are gonna emerge again. And I'm curious. I mean, I think what you said, which is like having recurring meetings that have like a specific purpose to address these things. But like, what about, what about kind of people chatting in a hallway near a whiteboard and they start sketching out stuff and, those sorts of things. Do remote employees just like, do you just miss out? Right.
Yeah. Oh man, I have so many thoughts about this. I think first off, and this actually been, a debate or like just passionate discussion between me and a lot of like industry leaders. There's certainly like a camp that's just like very strict. They're like, no, you should not have these discussions when then like everybody has to be remote. If one person is remote, that kind of thing, which, I bless him that he could run his organization that way. But I think when something is overly restrictive, it's like unlikely to be followed, right? Just human nature is just very hard for that. But I think you hit this really important point, which is, when people go back to the office, when there are some teams remote and some teams in the office, it's actually really important for the leader to experience remote at least part of the time. Because like that's actually precisely what I did a couple years ago, and this was before COVID, before hybrid work is really a thing that everybody talks about. I had part of my team, partially due to personal reasons, part of it because of just an acquisition, that the part of the team isn't all in the office, and the team that was in office has a really strong in office culture. But the fortunate thing, the first person that went remote was a really, really strong and well-respected engineering a tech lead. And so I remember asking the team, hey, as a team, we're going to need to make this work. So how are we going to do that? So like at first I thought, oh, why don't I set some policies, right? But then no, I think it's everyone's responsibility to make every single one of their team members feeling inclusive, like included, feeling heard, and leverage them, right? Like why else do we have teammates like somewhere else if we're not going to leverage them? And so together for that team, we came up with like certain tweaks to make sure that this person is included. And then the remote person was also very mindful and thoughtful about how he wants to be included. So I'll give you an example. So we were in the middle of revamping a new architecture, which means we know what the end outcome needs to be. We wanted like a new service that's going to ingest a lot of data and put it into certain format. So that was the project. And there was a lot of little design decisions that will get made throughout the day. And this remote person actually was in a different time zone. So it's like near impossible for him to be participating even through Zoom. So what we ended up doing was, we documented everything. So as we have these whiteboard discussions, we would record, or we would make sure to have like a Google Doc where we just took notes as we discussed. And every day we kind of there's a folder where these notes go to, and this person, the remote person, can check it out. And every day it's like we used to call it, it's like Christmas morning, because every morning we would wake up, this person who is in a different time zone has already done like a write-up and analysis prototype, as he was working in this slightly different time zone. Yeah. And we would wake up and oh my God, he just took all of our notes and took it to the next level. And so that ended up working out really well. And definitely much credit to this particular remote engineer. He was just amazing at being able to work with whatever circumstance. So I think there are ways around it, but I think one thing that you do want a team culture where everyone wants to make everyone else successful. So I think that's really key.
I love this story because I think a lot of times people always think of having some what I've heard is kind of oh, in office is clearly better, but we have to make these sacrifices to accommodate these remote employees. But we don't have as many conversations around the ways in which remote actually adds value, right? And so having this experience where, the team that's co-located with you is doing some work and then wakes up the next morning, and every morning there's little Christmas elves working away through the night. That's probably what it feels like. Just what a delightful feeling. And I imagine for team momentum is probably really powerful as well.
Yeah, to add one note to that, when that remote engineer came to visit, and he, we did encourage some amount of FaceTime, right? So he would visit once a quarter. And every time he visited, we used to joke oh my God, our team productivity is shrunk 50%, because there's not that engine where you take our thoughts and continue thinking about it without distraction and meetings, right, and then come back with something amazing. So yeah, that was it worked out really well in that situation. So.
Yeah, I think definitely a few things I wanted to point out, which was really having the team, individuals on the team feel like they want everyone to feel included so they can speak up. It's not just oh, this is how we work because my manager said so. So that feels really important, especially when you're onboarding onto a hybrid team as a new hire, really embracing that mindset of if as a remote employee, you're feeling you're missing out to say something, if you're, an in office employee and feeling hey, this person seems like they're not being included in this conversation, to also say something.
Yeah, I think that's going to the point of when I said a process to service problem early and like, repeatedly is really important. So a lot of how, in the past, how I sort of structure and have different processes or even policies within the team were all from retros. So
Yeah.
like I think started about 5 years ago, almost every team that I've managed and run, we do weekly or like every other week retros where people just talked about what went well and what didn't. And that is participated by everyone on the team. And so like, it's not just for some, it's just to vent, maybe to share how they feel. But then a lot of it is also to kind of see the trend. If like disproportionately, it could be someone in the office feeling like they're in too many meetings. It could be someone who is remote feeling like they were not included in certain discussion. It become everyone's responsibility to help mitigate that. And so like, when a set policy is there, sometimes depending on how people interpret or follow it, it might actually do more harm than good, right? But in having that process to always just serve as, oh, actually, the other day we had, a bunch of enough office people that said, oh, like there were too many meetings. What are we going to do about that? And so that back to the suggestion before where, yeah, I was like, I know someone who, used to be completely remote in a different time zone. They do a lot of documentation. So kind of reframing, bouncing back to the responsibility to each employee, you can go to less meetings if you're willing to do more documentation. But as a team, we're moving fast as a startup. We want to be cohesive and we want to be communicative. So yeah, so I think like having those processes and tune it along the way is really important.
Yeah, I think a lot of engineers have an aversion to feeling like there's a ton of process, but the way you're approaching it, which is kind of in response to the things people are bringing up in retro, kind of mitigates that that response to adding process.
Yeah, it's also giving them the choice a little bit, like which is the thing that you want more. Like choosing one means you losing out on something else. So pick your own journey, kind of thing.
Yeah. I think one thing that I've been hearing, and I've been like on this CS careers questions subreddit for a while now. And recently there's been a lot of threads about like, working remotely and companies that are maybe not as well thought out as yours or your team. And like just a lot of remote employees feeling like it's inevitable that remote is like out of sight, out of mind in terms of like, oh, I don't see anyone in the office, so I forget to check in on the intern, or like I'm not in the office, so people, don't think about me when they think about promos, or, I don't get that FaceTime with the in-office execs, and so I don't get considered for opportunities. So for, in a hybrid team or in a remote team, if you are a remote employee, what are some tactical things you can do to make sure you and your work is visible, even if the company isn't really, set up so thoughtfully?
Oh, that's a really tough one. Like before I dive into answering exactly that question, I would say, and I do get these questions from candidates, but I think if I were a candidate, I would ask, and if I were remote and I'm a candidate, I would ask, what is the percentage of your leaders or employees that are remote, right? Because if you're the only one, chances are it's going to be tough.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's a lot of what, changes processes or get people to behavior to change is empathy. So if you're disproportionately unique and disadvantaged, that you're gonna, it's gonna be an uphill battle regardless. So I do think that is true.
I mean, that's true. So like if it feels like, I think there's more and more companies that are going to be like, it felt like a few years ago, there weren't that many companies that supported remote work. And so as a remote employee, you kind of like tolerated more stuff that wasn't ideal. And I feel like as companies are figuring this out, like there's going to be more options. So one suggestion could be like, like maybe find a company that's a better fit where it's not going to be such an uphill battle.
Right. Yeah. And then I remember thinking like, especially if you're joining as a leader, if the company have like, 90% of their leaders are on site and you're remote. I've definitely been in that situation, like, in the past where, well, I was in the office and there was one leader that was remote, and then, in the same time zone, so not like different time zone or anything, but we would always forget him in our leadership meetings. Like we just all, went and grabbed lunch and talk while we're at lunch and like, oh, okay, leadership meeting. And then we just walk into the meeting room with our plates. And then of course, like 5 minutes later, somebody would be frantically, oh, Dal and Steven, we forgot to Dal and Steven. And
yeah, like we had someone working from the New York office, and regularly we forgot to dial her in to stand up. And it's like pretty embarrassing to think about back on that and just think about how poor of an experience it was for her.
Yeah. And I remember even when we did dial him in, we never know whether or not he could hear us. Right. And I remember, like me and another leader at the time were like, okay, we'll be like the remote buddies where, or like someone should be his remote buddy and check whether he could hear us. Because if he's not participating, is it just everything's good or he just couldn't hear a thing? Like we didn't know, but it was just it just wasn't very smooth, right? We didn't prioritize on his experience.
Right.
And then I remembered, like, then we got acquired, and then actually then the whole San Francisco team became the remote team in a way, because we were acquired by an Israeli company. And then everything changed, because like now so many people are remote. There was more thought about having good Wi-Fi signals, so Zoom meetings are more smooth. Actually buying people like equipment to make sure that like the sound and the video and all that is actually smooth. And then like being thoughtful about when to schedule the meeting so that people can actually attend. So it really shifts when there is just a need to make it work. So I think like as candidates going into these companies, you do want to hear like what is the percentage of like people who could be making changes are actually remote. And I remember talking with another leader at a bigger company, and they are definitely going back to the office, and I think at first they said September, but we're in September now and they're not back in the office. So like things are changing a little bit, but they they're starting to open their office and have people go in. I remember this person told me, most of the leaders are eager to go back to the office. But for him, he actually believes it's really important for him to stay remote for at least half the time, because they have since hired remote employees in different locations. Yeah. And like, he want to make sure that he is like, in a way, the gatekeeper when people's behaviors or processes or meetings slide to become remote unfriendly again. And so like, I think, having people in a position of like power and influence to be advocating for remote employees is actually really important, if it's not majority of the people are remote. And so, I think like as a candidate, you can certainly like choose and interview your company really well to make sure that they're a fit and they're thoughtful about remote arrangements. And I think too, there are things that you can do to make your work more visible, but ultimately there is a lot to be done by the leadership team if they care about this problem or not. So figuring that out early is good. And I think taking a step back to your question earlier, I remembered a while ago, it was starting to, especially when we first shifted to remote, everybody's like kind of just, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we still give people space to connect and celebrate? Because I think that was one of the things that really lead to burnout, is when you're not in the office, you don't get that, just like, high five or smile or like a nod or just like in-person impromptu.
You're not gonna schedule a Zoom meeting for high five.
I know, how weird would that be? I mean, I think there's like apps to do like high five, but that's still, it's not the same thing. And so like, how do you still create that space for people to celebrate each other's work, right? And as a side effect of that, you can also, then create a space for people to have their accomplishments shown in an asynchronous, non-office way, right? So I think some ways could be demo days, right? Like your recurring demo days where you get to show off your work. There are also just like Slack channels where, you give each other shout outs. I think that's a really fun and easy one where, because sometimes little things that like really build up to great cultures are not demoable, right? If somebody was like taking that extra time to review a PR and really coach you through something, maybe you can demo that. Or if, somebody revamped a certain process so that's easier for people to, have inclusive decision making, that's also not really something you could demo, but it's really impactful. So I think having a space where people are calling out what they appreciate about each other, it adds to the culture. It creates a space for building rapport and trust, and also allowing people to have their work be visible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our team does at the end of every 2-week cycle, in our company recap, we do like a fig jam board. And so it's like, when we want to celebrate this cycle, and people will like screenshot, things that launched, and then even just like, numbers that went up. And then we have a corner that's like the gratitude corner, and people will put people's faces and then be like, oh, thanks for, being really responsive on PRs, or kind of the less visible things, like less of like, thanks for launching this feature, but more like, thanks for talking me through this problem I was having, or like, thanks for always doing the operations behind the scenes work. And it's really, really nice. And then we go through it all as a team, and then like stamp and put all sorts of ridiculous stickers on it. But that's kind of a nice, like, regular way to do that. And then like daily we'll do like, we use Range for check-ins. And so a lot of times we'll like tag things as like, thanks, and then tag the person for whatever it is, but that helps raise the visibility as well.
Yeah, one thing I also want to call out is I do find it for some people, they're not comfortable with self-promoting or like showing off their work. So in the remote environment, I imagine for particularly those folks, it's even harder because, there's always like, I've talked to a few people like that, and they're like, oh, I don't want to brag. It feels so showy. There's that mentality. I mean, that mentality is a challenge even if you're in the office, but even like more challenging if you're remote. And I think like for those type of like mindset, I usually just encourage them to say, a lot of times burnout is because people seemingly is just in a grind and in a grind, and they're not having moments of celebration, moments of like completion. You do want to feel like you've, done the hard work and you completed it and you celebrate it. And then you move on to the next thing instead of just this never ending cycle of work, right? And so like, I think sometimes just sharing accomplishment, maybe not just yourself and you and your team, it's not just for bragging rights. It's also for like team culture and morale. It's like everyone's happy for you and the company that you've done something great. And so like just screaming from the top of the roof and just have people celebrate with you. It's actually great for everyone. So yeah, it's like, I think those are some challenges I've seen people talk about.
Yeah, I think that aversion is, I mean, the impact is there when it's just your own work, but then when you become a leader and then you feel hesitant to share your team's work, that impact is then like, your whole team's work is really less visible, and they're, it's not, the impact of their work is not seen by the rest of the company, which is not just impacting you, but really impacting your whole team.
Yeah, and that's actually, you brought up a good point. I remember a few years ago, I was in one of the engineering leadership meeting, and I remember one leader said this. It was around review time, and he was like, I feel like we should have a metric to like evaluate each engineer, because some leaders are not so good at selling accomplishments of their team than others, and I don't want the selling skills of a eng manager to impact the review. And while that there's some truth to it, you do want metrics, and I always tell like my eng managers that I'm like, at the point where you're a manager, a people manager, even if you're just like a tech leader that leads a team, part of your job is to sell, right? Because you do have to correctly, accurately, represent their work and their impact. You need to be able to tie the work to the impact instead of just like, oh, they wrote this line of code really beautifully.
Right. You don't have to like overinflate and like exaggerate the impact, but you at least need to, do a one-to-one mapping of like, this is the
Right.
accurate
Why does it
impact.
matter? Why people should be excited about it? And why was it
Right.
uniquely challenging? And what did the team, why is it so special that the team, was able to accomplish it? And I think
Mhm.
it's like, if this is something that, certain leaders find really hard on, it's actually, a growth area, right? They
Yeah.
can, and I think one of the easiest way to kind of get like sign bites of that is just to ask your customer. Maybe if your customer is someone that is external to the company, get on a customer call and hear what they say about the product. If your customer are internal teams, just ask them, why does it matter that we do this? How does it
Mhm.
change, things for you? And just get their quote. You don't even
Mhm.
have to, say it yourself, right? And over time, you kind of build up that muscle because, for the most part, I think a lot of leaders are truly proud of their teams, and it's actually just putting it into words and getting over that like mental hurdle of like
Yeah. And
bragging.
that can
So
feel more authentic that someone else said it than I'm just saying this is the impact, right?
right, right. Or if you talk to your customer and they're like, no, this is no impact, then you have a bigger
Then
problem.
it's a good time to reassess what you're working on. Yeah.
Right. It's like, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ellen. I think this was kind of an unexpected takeaway from this talk, but I think we've like come up with a few really good questions for people to ask, like ask
Yeah.
the people when they're interviewing at a new company, just to like suss out like, is this a company that's really thoughtfully building a hybrid or remote team? And like, is it going to be an uphill battle to like, be heard, be included in decision making and team building, all these things. So I think those will be especially useful for folks if they're looking around.
Yeah, for sure. I hope that that's helpful.